Thanks very much. I was joking with some colleagues this morning about my participation in Education Day the last 3 years and how each year I've had these wildly different topics. So one year it was music and cognition, last year was neuropsychology, and this year I get to talk about how we can relate research to real life. And I was thinking, you know, the analogy here for me is what Scott, Brad, and Megan are talking about. They're the walls of this research and they're the weight bearers, and I'm kind of like the speckle in the unit where I just kind of fill in the holes. So hopefully I'll do a good enough job here in filling in the tiniest little holes and building on all the information that was presented to you this morning. It was an amazing overview of a lot of advances in terms of what people are doing for clinical trials, for understanding different diagnostic tools. But I thought for today what would be helpful is actually to bring the research back into this room. So thinking about from bench to bedside and back, and thinking about how all of you have contributed in a particular way. So oftentimes when we think about research participants such as yourselves, I'm always touched really and quite in awe of the time and commitment that you all put into contributing to this research world. It's time in the sense of just spending hours, if not days, out of your schedule to actually come in to work with us. And emotional energy. And thinking about this in the context of the burdened lives you already lead, I often wonder, how is it, sure, if that actually works. Just thinking about what drives that, you know, what is your motivation really for doing this? And sometimes we'll even ask some of you, why are you doing this? What motivates you to come in? And in fact, what ends up being the answer is, we want to contribute. We want to help in some way. And I thought maybe today would be helpful to actually bring it back to you all and to say, this is how you've actually been contributing directly to these studies. As I was saying, many of you devote a lot of time to contributing to this research, and so we thought it would be nice to bring it back to you. For those of you who participate, you come in year after year after year, you fill out numerous questionnaires, and you probably wonder what happens to it all. And so I'd like to touch upon just some of the studies where I think the data actually directly impact the research, what you contribute, and how this actually can be used in your daily lives and how it's impacting other people's lives. There are many stops along the road from care to cure, and it involves basically different types of studies, observational natural history studies, where we follow people over time and we're able to track progression. We're able to look at this data that you're bringing in with you every single year when you come in for these research studies. And we are able to actually use that to now say, you know, looking back 3 years ago when you came in and the behaviors you reported, can we look at that and say we can use that to predict how somebody's going to look 2, 3 years down the line? How are they functioning? What is the impact on their quality of life? Then once we've built the knowledge and the foundation for this type of research, we can go on to building experimental paradigms, looking at different manipulations of behavior in an experimental setting, with the idea that if we can discover something new about some brain-behavior relationship and some behavioral manipulation, that might lead to some sort of intervention at some point later down the line. This also leads to, as I'd mentioned, developing intervention studies, right? How can we use all of this information to figure out ways to intervene earlier on in the course of a disease, as well as developing these new diagnostic tools that Dr. McGinnis and Dr. Dickerson were talking about, and ultimately bringing them to clinical trials. And how does this all happen? Well, it's collaborations and partnerships, not just among the researchers and the clinicians, but mostly with you, with the caregivers and the patients. And so I thought it'd be helpful to say, go back to what does it all mean? This sounds very angsty and existential. I didn't mean it to be like, what does it all mean? But I may have been feeling that way when I put this slide together. I thought it would be helpful to think about what does it all mean with all of the data that you're bringing back in. So as I mentioned, you're using these questionnaires and really your stories about what you're observing in day-to-day life. You as the care partners and the caregivers have been participating in research in so many ways that I don't think we fully realize. You, in essence, are the observers. You are our eyes and ears. You can actually see what's going on in day-to-day life and bring that data into us, into the laboratory, so that we can then use that to be able to correlate it with behavior that we see that we can test, with cognitive tests, paper and pencil measures to look at memory and changes over time, to correlate it with new imaging studies and techniques that we're using. So that's why I feel as though you're just as important in this research path, and in many ways much more so than those of us in the lab. And we rely on this. So you provide those data points. Now we're thinking that the research is really focusing on the disease, but as you've already heard this morning, we're focusing on more than that. We're thinking about the full spectrum. So even though right now you're living, breathing, thinking about, and really just focusing on how do we modify the disease currently, a lot of the data that you're actually contributing also helps us look at how do we intervene earlier. Now that we have better tools for seeing whether or not somebody has pathology in their brain before they even become symptomatic, but the pathology raises the risk of them developing symptoms, can we actually think about ways to intervene earlier when they're at the stage of mild cognitive impairment or even preclinically, okay? Not only do we want to think about disease, but we want to think about the range of cognitive functioning over the course of the lifespan. Because if we can understand the full spectrum of what works and what doesn't work, we can actually leverage all of that information looking at, let's say, a healthy elderly brain, figure out what makes that brain particularly resilient, and figure out the individual differences that we see in the manifestation of certain disorders. Why is it some people develop symptoms sooner or later? Are there certain factors that can help influence the trajectory? So that's why I think it's so important that we're actually contributing to these types of studies, both in healthy as well as in the disease states. So now I just want to touch upon some of the major studies that I'm sure all of you have contributed to in some way, shape, or form, starting with the natural history studies. So the big ones, the longitudinal evaluation of familial FTD, and the advancing research and treatment of frontotemporal lobar degeneration, artful and lefties. And what did we do with these natural history studies? Essentially, it was about learning more about the spectrum of these frontotemporal lobar disorders, understanding from those data that we actually are collecting what kinds of new therapies might be possible, looking at new diagnostic tools, ways to actually measure behavior and change based on multiple sources of information. We're getting all sorts of information from imaging studies, from CSF, from other biomarkers, and of course, cognitive assessments over time. From your participation in Artful Lefties, you've always also helped establish a patient contact registry. You've provided an opportunity for patient advocacy, and you're providing an opportunity to train future investigators, to actually foster novel research approaches. So these natural histories build the foundation upon which we can actually keep going. Recently, the LEAD study, which is the longitudinal early-onset Alzheimer's disease study, was just launched last year. It involves, I want to say, 14 sites. And again, same idea, natural history observation. We want to collect data and understand and try to study Alzheimer's in patients where the disease is manifesting earlier in life. And what's special about this population is that you don't have the confounds and complications potentially of other medical issues that might arise when we start evaluating and following people in older age. But again, the hope is with all the data we're able to collect, not only from patients, but also healthy individuals, many of whom are caregivers, we'll be able to strengthen this knowledge base on which we can actually develop the therapies. Now, out of these natural history studies, we were able to develop our own family study. And this is something that was spearheaded by Dr. Dickerson and Diane Lucenti, looking at what happens when somebody has the knowledge, the understanding that they might carry a genetic mutation for FTD. When you think about it, having that knowledge, and especially when you're not symptomatic, you know that FTD is in the family, you're not sure who might have the genetic mutation and who might develop FTD, what the weight of that knowledge might do to you. And how that knowledge and understanding of the disease, either firsthand or going to the internet or learning it from the doctor, how is that going to influence your decision to actually pursue genetic testing? And if you should decide to pursue genetic testing, how do you decide whether or not you learn your results? Right? It's a complicated matter, and what we're trying to understand there is, how do people think about this? What are the factors that lead people potentially to making the decision of learning their status or not? What kinds of personality issues or factors feed into the resilient person How do people think about the consequences of learning this information that's really quite impactful when you think about future planning? And so we're hoping that through this study and the knowledge and education that we're doing with Diane, who's actually helping us to see how much they're able to gain in addition to their baseline knowledge, what else can be helpful for teaching them and preparing them for making these decisions, and then understanding what that psychological impact is. I'm hoping that data from this study will actually help other clinicians figure out how best to coach other individuals facing this thought of learning what their genetic status is. Now, in addition, when we're still thinking about building upon the foundations, we're talking about new behavioral paradigms, but we're also talking about developing new tools. As you heard earlier on, PET scans, they're not necessarily covered all the time by insurances, and it can be prohibitive. It's about, I think, $3,000 to get a PET scan if your insurance doesn't cover it. And this is a potentially life-changing tool here because it gives us insight into things that may be coming down the road, let's say. So as part of that, another study that Dr. Dickerson and colleagues, Dr. Purdon, are working on is to try to figure out, are there different tools that we can develop that can be a proxy for the PET scans? Are there tools using, for example, EEG and studying brain waves and sleep architecture? Can we use that to figure out if it's comparable in terms of identifying underlying pathology? So really thinking about some sort of proxy for the PET scan. So again, these are also studies that many of you may be participating in the very near future. Other studies, as I mentioned earlier on, we talk about trying to understand the brain in the healthy individual as well. Another study that Dr. Dickerson and his colleague, Dr. Lisa Feldman-Babbitt, have been working on, is really looking at affect and arousal. And thinking about how reactivity to stressors, to unpleasant events, how one reacts to that may be associated with underlying biological markers. And the paradigm that I think about is, how do you deal with a situation? Do you see it as a threat or as a challenge? And looking at reactivity and arousal in those situations. And the most amazing thing about this body of research is that serendipitously, they actually discovered a subgroup of individuals who are called superagers, which to me, I mean, I really imagine that they're flying in from the sky and they are, the superheroes here. What makes a superager? This happened to be a group of individuals who are older and happened to perform like younger individuals on cognitive testing. Certain parts of their brains looked a little bit more like that 20-year-old. So the question is, what makes an 80-year-old look like a 20-year-old? And how is this related to dementia research? Well, if you can figure out and what those factors might be, maybe we can actually think about using those factors in a form of intervention when we identify individuals who are at risk for developing dementia later on. Earlier on in life, we see that they may have the biological markers, they're asymptomatic. Maybe we can figure out how to intervene with some of the factors that can be identified from these superagers. Along the lines of intervention studies that the unit is involved in, people often are looking for brain training activities. What kinds of Sudoku exercises and crossword puzzles should we be doing? And it turns out that Dr. Dickerson, again, is involved in very innovative research with Dr. Sarah Lazar, who's an expert in meditation research, and they've been looking at the impact of meditating, mind-body activity essentially, on memory functioning in addition to concentration skills, and then seeing how that translates potentially to performance on paper and pencil measures, to functioning in daily life. Right now they're focusing how this impacts the brain in the healthy, but now they're moving towards how does meditation impact the brain and memory in patients with mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so we are now, again, moving earlier on in the course of a disorder and trying to understand what kinds of interventions might actually be impactful later on. As Dr. McGinnis already discussed, non-invasive brain stimulation. This is a study that Dr. Eldaev is leading in our group, where he is essentially looking at non-invasive brain stimulation, TMS in particular, as a way to affect the magnetic fields and stimulate nerve cells in the brain in areas where the cells are underactive. And he's doing this right now in both PPA patients and patients who've been diagnosed with MCI. So now we're in the intervention bucket here. And along those lines, this is the amazing part to me, thanks in part to efforts of people like Katie. Really, Caregiver and the work of caregivers and what caregivers go through, it's really being highlighted now, and people really want to focus on researching how best to support caregivers. So we're actually now involved in a study where we're trying to understand what kinds of teaching aids might actually help impart important information to caregivers and patients when they have to start making really life-changing decisions about a family member's future. It's very hard in these atypical dementias to really think about what down the road will look like. It's hard to imagine that, especially in the context of a conversation in a doctor's office. So the goal of this study, that again is being spearheaded by Katie and colleagues, is that they're trying to figure out what are the best video interventions, video educational tools that might be helpful for each stage of dementia. And then from there, hopefully this can be turned into an intervention about how to support caregivers that can be used in the community. Okay, so again, more studies that are looking at intervention, but building on all of the information that we've talked about just now. So really, all of these studies, the goal is really understanding the brain across the lifespan. And again, you've all been contributing to this, whether or not you realized it all along for many years. And the goal really is, can we figure out what to do today when people are symptomatic or even pre-symptomatic, but maybe developing symptoms? And can we intervene at various points to potentially change that trajectory? And hopefully the goal will be, we're going to work towards hitting that point where we're before symptomatic and we can actually change the course of cognitive decline so that it's not going to be as devastating as it can be today. Understanding these underlying brain mechanisms, identifying the targets for the intervention, this leads to efficacy studies, clinical trials, as Dr. McGinnis was describing. And if you think about it, your participation in these studies ultimately leads to legislative changes. It's influencing how we are thinking about medical care being provided to our patients. How are the physicians being tasked now to provide the right care to atypical dementias? It's something that I think we forget about when we're in a place like Boston, but realizing that, and I hear this from an online support group that I run, patients who have atypical dementias across the rest of the country, they really don't have the expertise in the area. And part of it is that maybe the physicians just don't have the training for it, the background for it, or if they do have the background, they've never seen the patients before. And the patient ends up being the educator, the one with the expertise. So it would be nice if we could actually get it to the point where all of this research says we need to change the system in some way so that we can provide care better, disseminate information more thoroughly, and also influence things such as insurance coverage, right? It would be wonderful if we could actually get to the point where we can demonstrate the efficacy of certain diagnostic tools, interventions, and say, you know, we'd like for insurance to be able to cover this. It's usually an efficacy trial, so that more people can access these tools and these interventions. Where do we see the future of research? It's the citizen scientists, and Katie's going to talk a lot more about this and more eloquently than I ever can. This is where I see the future is. It's really about everybody here in this room. And when I think about how you are all much more expert in your lives and in the diseases that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, I don't think of you anymore as patient and caregiver. I think of you more as educators, advocates, scientists. You're the ones who are going to help develop the new approaches. You're going to demonstrate their usefulness, and then you're going to get the findings out there. You're going to educate the world. And as a result of that, the FTD unit and the scientific community thanks you.